focusing in on this C, which is at the 8th fret of the guitar on the E string, looking at the C major scale, which could also be called the Ionian mode, the C Ionian mode. However, as we go through this, we want to basically be practicing many other things as well. One of our objectives, of course, being to try to put together more technical exercises so that we can get some of the more technical components of the guitar down when our mind is working best. The best way to do that is to try to come up with exercises that cram as much of the technical information in as possible that we can practice in the shortest period of time. So the ways that we can basically do this, or a few ways that we can practice our guitar, is by shape, learning basically the caged system, for example, and then moving those shapes up the guitar. And then we can learn different positions, which usually span 4 to 5 frets, because that's how the guitar is designed. Why? Because that's how our hand is designed. And then we can learn intervals, making the same basic shape by learning the intervals, which is great for chord construction. And then we're going to do what we're doing here, which is the formulas. All these three things kind of tied together. I'd like to be to the point where I can kind of switch my mind from going from one to the other. So as I focus on one particular thing, I'm still going to kind of try to keep the other things in mind. So this time, for example, we're looking at like one string on the guitar at a time, but then we're going to use that to jump to multiple strings, remembering that when you're on a piano, you have one string, basically, is what the piano's kind of laid out like. Similar to the guitar. Obviously the guitar takes multiple strings, so now you've got multiple pianos that are kind of like on top of each other, with which you're playing with only one hand over here instead of basically two hands on the piano, which is the general idea. So how do you deal with that grid shape? Typically we learn then with a grid shape of our hand as to what the current notes or scales or formulas that we're going to be playing, the chords in other words. But we can also learn that, again, with the intervals and with basically the formula, as long as we know the distance between the strings, which gives us another way to basically, walk through a particular scale and see where we are to situate ourselves within the scale. So what we're going to do is we're going to do that with our C major scale again. And as we get to the interval from the 6th to the 7th, that's when I'm going to jump to all of the other strings. So I'm going to walk through the scale, and then when I get to the step of the 6th to the 7th, I'm going to basically jump to one of the other strings so that we can see how we can basically take the formula and take any step within the formula and jump to any string we want, and then play the rest of it on that string or within that shape. As we do that, I also want to kind of keep in mind the major shape that we are in. And this is what we might call position number 1, that if it was pentatonic, sounds like that, 7 notes. If you start from the C, we would be going from the C to the C, right? So, whoops, right there, right? We're going from C to C so that we would be in the major. And so we'll learn it on one string, and then we'll basically look at this particular shape. And then as I go through these formulas, I also want to kind of get in my mind where each of the modes live as part of my basic routine. So notice a lot of times when people do this, they get really technical. We start to get really technical on the language and possibly coming up with our own terms and whatnot. And one of the reasons for that is because we're trying to cram as much information in our mind about things that are somewhat abstract, right? So that's why I'm going to come up with basically the idea of different shapes within the guitar. I'm going to try to come up with a visualization of what those shapes are. And as we run through the scale, I would also like to learn the relative modal positions. And that's going to be useful for us because as I move the shape up, if I can learn those relative modal positions, then I'll be able to play chords from each of those different modal chord shapes and possibly also see how I can basically concentrate on the different modes. So I'm trying to work in as well to understand the modes, and we'll also, as we work through our shape, look at the interval, not just from step to step, but to the root. So in other words, you'll note that when we walk through this, we go from the one to the 2, so I can see the distance there. When I go to the 3, I'm looking at the distance from the last point I was at to go to the 3. That means that I'm always going to be moving from the last step. If I take another step, if I'm walking, then whenever I walk and I take a step, I can imagine that I can only reach a half step or a whole step. But when I think about my total distance that I have gone, then I can compare that to the any other place, but usually to the starting point, right? How far have I gone from the starting point, which I'm thinking of as the starting point of the scale that I'm in. So I'll try to look at that. That's basically looking at it from a modal standpoint as we go through it as well. So I'm going to keep kind of this shape in mind, but then we're going to go outside that shape when we're on one string, so we can kind of compare and contrast what it would be like when I go on one string versus going down the string within one hand position, which is within 4 to 5 frets typically. And I want to be thinking about the shapes within here. So notice once I look at this shape, I can call that, you might call that a C major chord, which is in the shape of a G, right? So from a caged system, here's your G shape right there. So you could call this shape a G shape based on the major chord caged system if we wanted to as well. So we can look at it from that perspective. And I lost where I was going. So as I go through the shape, I also want to see within the shape, I'm going to break it out between 2 string and 1 string chunks. So there's basically 6 strings on the guitar, but you can kind of think of the guitar as a 5-stringed instrument with a repeated 6th string that's just an octave higher than the top string. So if you break the shapes down on like a 5-string instrument, I can further break them down to a 2-string shape, and then I'm going to say this is a 1-string shape, and then this is a 2-string shape, and then this is the top of the same shape up top. So in other words, I'm going to say this is going to be a double stop box or house shape, and then I've got the middle shape, which I'm going to say is 1 string, which I'm going to call the meat of the hamburger, because if I was in a pentatonic, I would call this the hamburger shape if we made it just a pentatonic. So that's the middle point of the hamburger. And then this is what I call the house double stop, because this same shape is down here, and then the double stop is here. Why does it look different? Because there's a fault line, what I call a fault line here. This tectonic shape plate shifted to the right. So you can see this is the same box as here, but it's been shifted because of the earthquake that happened. And then this is going to be the same, the top of the double stop box shape. So if I can further break the shapes down within these 4 to 5 fret spans to something like that, and that's not the only way to do that, right? I don't have to see it as the double stop. I might look at it from a pentatonic standpoint, in which case I would constantly see this shape, which I might call like the hamburger, right? So you can visualize that different ways as well. But the point is, I can break it down that way, and then I can look within this shape and say, okay, now I'm on the double stop house shape, and I can identify each modal position within the shape. Why is that useful? That's useful because it'll help me to play different modes, but also useful because I want to be able to play different chords within the scale that I'm in. So whatever scale I'm in, I would like to be able to say, oh, that F is a Lydian. It's in the Lydian position. It's in the bottom right of the square. That's a Lydian position. And I know the Lydian is a major scale. Therefore, I know that I can make a major triad when I'm on that note. And beyond that, I know that I can make a modal chord related to the Lydian, right? So that takes us a step further than being able to say the 1, 4, 5 makes a major scale, the 2, 3, and 6 make a minor, and the 7 is diminished. You can try to think of it that way, but notice that then I have to remember this as the 4th related to the major scale. And then when you get to another mode, you're going to run into a problem because it's not the 4th of another mode. What I could say is it's the absolute 4th when I'm saying the major scale is my key reference. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say it's actually the start of mode number 4, which I'm giving an absolute mode reference based on the relative position to the major scale. And that will never change, right? If I go to another key, the key of G, I'll still find this box, right? And then I can still say that that's whatever note is in the bottom right of that box is still going to be what I would call absolute mode number 4. And if I go to the Dorian or something like that, the box is the same. It's no longer the 4th position with relation to the Dorian, because now I'm starting on what I would call absolute mode number 2. But we still see that it's, even though it's relative position 3, I'm still going to call it absolute mode number 4. It's the start of absolute mode number 4. It's the start of the Lydian mode right here. And so if I learn it that way, then I think that's the most efficient way to try to orient ourselves facing in the right direction as we're moving through the circle of the guitar, right? As we're going around all these different modes. That's what we're trying to kind of do, situate ourselves in so I know where I'm on the fretboard, so I have the flexibility to be creative. Otherwise, I can't really be creative because I'm just guessing where I'm going. I have no concept of what I'm doing if I don't have some idea, either from a shape perspective, from a modal perspective, or from a like a formula perspective. I have to have some idea of what why I'm putting something together in my mind, somewhere in my mind, right? I guess it's not like, so that's what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so before we get into it,